Hello and welcome to Marie's Mindful Makes. My name is Marie and I'm going to talk about my Mindful Makes. Who would have thought? Today we're going to start out with a super fun topic, which is going to be how to embroider on your own clothes. Whether you're making your own clothes or you want to embroider store-bought clothes, the options are endless, and I think embroidery can add so much fun and character to a garment. It can be a really smart mending technique, and it's just fun and beautiful. So let's talk about it. But before I'm getting to all the talking, let's grab some knitting, grab some embroidery, grab yourself a creative project. If you don't have anything at hand, grab yourself a nice drink and enjoy. Today you can see me wearing my mini mock neck tank, designed by Jessie Made Designs. It is something that I very recently finished. It's a hand knitted tank top. The yarn uses fingering weight, so it's very lightweight, perfect for summer. I used knitting for olive merino. It really stretches very nicely over the entire body. I did add waist shaping to accentuate the shape of my waist just a little bit more. The original pattern has no waist shaping and just goes down straight from the arms to the hem. The embroidery that you can see on my mini mock neck tank is inspired by the Daisy sweater designed by Knitting for Olive, but I just kind of freestyled it. And I will talk a little bit more about how that went in just a minute. So now you already had the chance to get a better look at my mini mock neck tank, which is a top that I've finished very recently. I've knitted it over the summer, and particularly during outdoor dances. I've been taking this to all of my dances because it's very straightforward, very little thinking involved. So this is a great project to take with you wherever you want to go. But what I want to talk about today is the embroidery, both in this top and then also just embroidering on garments in general. A little bit of a backstory. I have been wanting to embroider on my own knitting since forever, but then there were always reasons to not do it. One of the reasons being quite often that I liked a design very much when it was finished, and I was like, no, nothing can make this more perfect, not even embroidery. I think with embroidery, it is always a little bit tricky because it can add so much to a garment, but then it can also put that garment in one very specific box, and it can be more difficult to style it with all kinds of things. I have the same thing with this top, where I feel like it looks amazing with a denim skirt or maybe a pair of jeans, very plain trousers, but it doesn't really go with all of my floral dresses. As with all crafty adventures, embroidering, especially embroidering on clothes, something that we want to pair with other things, can be a little bit tricky. So I'm hoping that with this video we can just talk about a little bit of these tricky areas, what's important to consider in general, not style-wise, just in general, basic things to know about, so that maybe you also will ramp up the courage to embroider your own clothes. So there are a few reasons why in the end I settled on embroidering this specific top. First of all, it is a very simple design, straightforward, stockinette stitch. There's not much to distract the eye. Same goes for the color. The yarn I've chose is a machine dyed solid yarn, so it's a very plain canvas for any embroidery that should go onto it. And if you're just starting out with trying to embroider on your own knitting, I would also advise to maybe look rather for basic patterns and solid or maybe semi-solid yarn, but not so much artistic chaos already in the knitting, because you want your embroidery to shine, of course. And then of course you also want to consider the thickness of your yarn. This is a light fingering weight, so it's very thin and the stitches are very small, which is perfect for more delicate embroidery stitches like this, because you just have more room to play around. But then again, that is also something that's up to practice. I personally just in general prefer the look of smaller stitches and of lightweight knitting. In the end of the day, it's up to personal taste. You can embroider on any yarn thickness. It just might have a little bit of a different feel, just as a thicker or lighter sweater have very different feels as well. But that of course brings you to the next thing, that you need to decide what kind of complexity you want. These are some very simple daisies Though I would say that daisy stitch isn't necessarily the easiest stitch that you could go for, because it needs a little bit of time to get accustomed with the tension that you need. So if you want to try out something like this, trying out the daisy stitch, I would recommend to maybe first try on your gauge swatch, try to see like how the stitches feel. If you're like me and you want to embroider right onto your top, maybe then you also have to live with the fact that you'll have to undo it many times and will be frustrated throughout the process, whatever floats your boat. But in either way, if you've never done any embroidery, I'd recommend you try embroidery on a woven solid fabric first before you then go into your knitting. If you want to go for a more complex pattern, a wildflower bouquet, a bird, a butterfly, I don't know, it's like no boundaries to creativity. I would recommend to work with wash away stabilizer. We'll also talk about that a little bit more in the second part, just so that you already know that this is something that works very well on knitting as well as any other fabric. And then one last thing that I would say is very specific to embroidering on hand knits is that I would very strongly advise to first wet block your garment and then embroider. Because as we all know, a lot of magic happens during the first blocking process. The stitches relax, they kind of wiggle into the same groove. If you now have an embroidery in some parts, it will just interfere with the stitches, and it might, the whole blocking process might even mess up your beautiful embroidery. So definitely once you finish your garment, wet block it, let it dry, and then dive into your beautiful embroidery. Embroidery is a centuries-year-old craft and art and has been used forever to embellish garments, embellish home decor, embellish anything made from fabric, because people love beautiful things. And I am one of those people who very, very much loves beautiful things. So I am very drawn towards embroidery. And I also really like the activity of embroidery. I think it is very meditative. It's a beautiful craft. To me, it feels different to sewing on knitting because it has purely aesthetic reasons. It is only an embellishment and there is very little practicality to it in comparison to knitting yourself a sweater or making a pair of trousers. At the same time, I have mixed feelings about embroidery on clothing as well, because what I already mentioned before, I have a feeling that sometimes it can give so much character to a garment that it then kind of limits that garment to a specific occasion or specific combination or a very specific vibe. I have this one dress that I really like the embroidery. It's a bunny embroidery, but I realized that I don't actually wear it that often because it just has this very specific vibe for me, and I don't very often feel like a cottagecore bunny fairy. But that's the vibe. But I think in the end of the day, it is something that comes down to personal taste, and it's also something that, as with any other things, you just kind of have to find your right balance of what works for you and what does not. And to maybe help you find an embroidery that works for you, we're going to talk a little bit about a few basic things that are important to consider anytime you want to do embroidery. This will not be a tutorial for you to tell you exactly how to do the embroidery, but maybe if you will then later embark on your own journey, it will already help you knowing where to start Googling tutorials for the actual embroidery. A few things that you need are, of course, a fine, sharp needle. So it is worth going into a haberdashery to invest in maybe a new pair of embroidery needles. You will need embroidery thread. I have some here. So this is how it looks. And you want to wind it before you actually use it, because this is a skein, and if you start pulling here, it will mess up the entire skein and it will look terrible. So what you want to do, let's see, you want to maybe get something like this where you can wind it on. Cardboard does it just as well. Take a little bit of cardboard, wind it on, and then you can get to your embroidering. I really love to use wash away stabilizer. There are different stabilizers that you can use. You can trace your design on them, and then you can put them on top of your fabric. You'll draw the design and then you stitch through both the wash-away stabilizer as well as the fabric, and as the name says, in the end you can wash away the stabilizer and what remains is your beautiful stitched design. And then of course you might need an embroidery hoop. For something like this, knitting on embroidery on the knitting, I didn't use a hoop. And I'm also going to talk about what to look out for when hooping your design in just a bit. So once you have your tools at hand, you need to think about the design that you want to embroider. In the beginning, what I really like are little motifs at the chest level of a t-shirt or a blouse. I think pockets make a really, really good place for embroidery. At the wrists can be a nice place. I also really like the neck of a dress or a blouse as a place for maybe a little bit of a bigger embroidery. But in the end of the day, anything goes. You will have to decide whether you want to use an existing design, maybe from a book, maybe from an independent pattern designer online, or whether you want to freestyle it and come up with your own design. I don't think that it's a terrible idea to dive right into your own designing, especially if you have a very specific idea, you have a specific word that you want to embroider, for example. Why spend hours looking for that design if you can just do it yourself and then maybe watch a random tutorial on something similar, maybe another word, just to get an idea for the technique. Depending on the complexity of the design, you either might want to trace it on wash-away stabilizer, especially if it's not your own design. That is probably a good idea. If it's something really simple, I don't know, a simple heart or something like that, you might just be able to freestyle it. You can always also, of course, trace it directly to the fabric with some fade-away pen or a wash-away pen. And that brings us already to the next very important part, which is the fabric that you want to embroider on. And we're going to spend a little bit more time here just because the fabric makes a huge difference in what is important and what you need to consider. So we already talked about hand knitted fabric a little bit. If you have a more intricate design on knitwear, I would always recommend to utilize wash-away stabilizer just because it gives you more space to actually embroider on. The embroidery needle will then go through the stabilizer and through not only the stitches but also the actual fabric, and it will really anchor your design in the knitting. Something that you want to be really aware of when you're embroidering on your knitting is tension. So first of all, I would always advise against an embroidery hoop on knitting because it allows your fabric to lie flat, and do not stretch out too much because the idea of an embroidery hoop is to really hold the fabric very taut and stiff. But that's not what you want, because if you stretch it, it will change the garment structure and the shape of the garment, and that is not what you want, embroider or not. And the same goes when you are embroidering on it. You also need to make sure not to pull your threads too tensely because it will also alter the shape of your embroidery. You'll get a feel for it quite quickly, so don't worry about it at all. I would say the standard fabric to embroider on are linen fabrics or cotton fabrics, anything woven, rather sturdy and not so easy to distress. This is, for example, for those beautiful hoops. All of these different motifs are usually done on either linen or cotton fabrics, but of course you can also embroider on all other woven fabrics. Some of them have a lot more drape and are more delicate than linens or wovens, such as rayon fabric, for example. So there you want to make sure that your needle really is fine enough to stitch through the fabric, and you also definitely want to use an embroidery hoop, especially with drapey fabrics. You're gonna hate your life if you don't have an embroidery hoop. With the linens and cottons, I would also very much advise, because the embroidery hoop in that case really helps you with the right tension. I think when it comes to garments, most of my embroidered garments are from linen fabrics. Some linens have a rather loose weave, where especially with very detailed designs and thread painting designs can be a little bit tricky to find enough space to go with your stitches. Then again, I would advise in favor of wash away stabilizer, and the same goes for intricate details. It's just easier, and why make your life harder, right? Another very popular fabric to embroider on, especially in recent years, or so it seems to me at least, is denim fabric. Maybe you've seen images of really cool denim jeans patch pockets that are being embroidered. Denim jackets are also very popular for embroidery, and I think it looks super cool. Same goes as for all woven fabrics. Denim tends to be woven if there is a certain stretch percentage in there. Just make sure that you maybe don't stretch it out to the very limit, but usually even stretched denims have a rather low stretch percentage, so you shouldn't be worried too much about that. The only difference is that denim can be really, really thick and a little bit difficult to embroider through. So I would advise to go very easy on, seams, for example. If you really want to stitch over denim seams, you might gonna need to have some tools that help you push and pull the needle through. But other than that, denim is a fabric that works absolutely perfect for embroidery. And then there is another category of fabrics that I want to cover, which is knit fabrics. For example, sweatshirt fabric or t-shirt fabric, jersey fabrics. And again, with those kind of fabrics, you have to really watch out for tension. Because the fabrics stretch, it can be tricky to put them into an embroidery hoop, because if you're stretching them out too much, it will mean that your finished design will be absolutely distorted if you put on the garment, especially with jersey fabrics, t-shirt fabric. So what I always do is I have an embroidery hoop that I open up very, very large, so it's much larger. I rest my fabric on the lower part of the embroidery hoop, and then I very gently put the top part of the embroidery hoop on top of that, and I close it, and I make sure that I don't stretch it out further, and then I rather try to embroider a little bit lightly and don't pull all that much, so to allow for the embroidery to leverage the stretch that is in the fabric. I honestly have never done a really big embroidery on a t-shirt. Should be fine. You can also at some point stabilize the fabric by putting, same as you would do with applique, putting maybe a sturdier fabric underneath, which for certain areas that don't need to stretch out so much is absolutely fine. But if you have small embroideries, if you just want to add a little heart to the chest of your t-shirt or a little flower decor to your sweatshirt, it's absolutely fine to do it without any additional stabilizer. It shouldn't be any issue. And sweatshirt, because it is a thicker fabric and it also doesn't stretch out quite as much as jersey fabric, for example, is even easier to work with. The important thing to remember is to be really careful with tension whenever you're working with a knit fabric, especially with t-shirts. But I already embroidered t-shirts when I wasn't a very experienced embroiderer, and it worked out fine, so you'll be fine too. There are a few things that I would say consider. Consider design location. And I think there's a lot of different areas which work super well for a design. I would only caution against heavy duty areas. If you are a person who constantly has the hands in their pockets, then maybe you don't want to have a design that sits where you always rub with your hand, right? If you have a patch pocket that sits at a part of the bed where you actually sit on, it can shorten the life of that embroidery significantly. Those kind of things to consider. And if you're making your own clothes, I would usually advise to add the embroidery before you finalize the garment. Of course, you need to be careful that if you're working in a neckline, that you have stabilized your neckline so it doesn't stretch out. You also need to make sure you're considering seam allowance in the placement of your design. But I think it's nice to first embroider and then finalize the whole garment, also because it allows you to, for example, hide the inside of an embroidery with linings or facings. And that is something that I generally think is a really good protective measure for your embroidery, because of course there is some rubbing happening with every embroidery that sits right to the skin, and it hasn't happened to me, but it can happen that it then dissolves quicker um, rather than when it's actually protected. This is something that I would say is particularly important to consider when you are embroidering clothes for kids who just have the tendency to find every mistake in any system. So if there's something just slightly off with your embroidery, maybe there's one thread that wasn't secured well enough, rest assured that a kid's gonna find it. So if I'm embroidering for kids, I usually make sure that it is covered. Something that I also really like, if you are embroidering on ready to wear garment, you can always create a patch. So this is what I mean. You have your embroidery, you have it on a little patch, and then you can decide, either you can sew it on like this, or you could actually cut out the motif, sew it on as it is, or you could also transfer the motif to iron on foil and then iron it onto your garment. There are a lot of different possibilities to explore to make sure your embroidery is secure and protected wherever you want to put it and on whosever clothes they're gonna end up on. And then I think another very common concern is about washing the embroidery. And there I would really say, don't worry. I embroidered napkins for my mother a few years ago, and they're being used, they're being washed. And as long as you make sure that your threads are secured, it really shouldn't be an issue. What I like to make sure is that my threads are not only secured and knotted, but then I also kind of stitch over it as I continue with the embroidery, just to make sure that there really is no way for those ends to escape. Okay, that is it. Those are my tips for embroidering on your clothes. I hope it was helpful to you. If you have any other questions, let me know down below in the comments. If you see somebody's question and you think you have a great idea for it, let's make it a discussion. Let's talk about it. Crafting is something where every one of us knows so many different things. It's so highly dependent on personal taste, on personal experience. So I definitely want to be the one who said, I have the authority on all things embroidery on clothes. I definitely don't. But I do think by this time I've learned a good deal about what's important and what matters. I really hope that you're inspired now to also try out something yourself. If you liked this episode, make sure to hit that like button. If you want to see more content like that, I would be super happy if you wanted to subscribe to my channel. And I hope I see you next time. Goodbye.